And this is where I answer that question. Why was this convention created to begin with? Because individual nation states recognize that it's a global problem. But what does this global problem entail? The fact that your borders are being breached by individuals who did not legitimately choose to enter that country to begin with. And this is a serious problem, right? Because they already consider under that side of the house, there is a natural incentive to you to wanting to accept when you join that convention to begin with. And we think that natural incentive is born by the fact that your borders are breached. But secondly, we also think, Mr. Speaker, in terms of individuals' ability to participate, we think that there's a substantive amount of responsibility that you can still employ, and because you recognize that your borders are in breach as well. Recognizing that there are member states that will be willing to take, or at the very least play some form of part, this is where we think that the United Nations should push above and beyond just a symbolic signatory status within this particular nation state as well, Mr. Speaker. But secondly, why was my point of information important in terms of addressing the overburdening of states? In terms of the sentiments that you have, the fact of the matter is that when you have individuals that don't sign, is because of several reasons, right? And the largest one is because of the rhetoric that we don't like particular individuals, or we don't want to accept particular cultures within that nation state. At the very least, the physical limitation under our side of the house is expanded in terms of allowing for countries to be able to trade in terms of when they cannot physically accept more refugees at the end of the day. But secondly, why is it accepting a symbolic signatory not necessarily enough? Why does the United Nations has an obligation to uphold the legitimacy of that particular convention? Because we have to recognize this issue. Where do refugees predominantly come from? That they are spillovers of war. And for example, refugees from Syria amounts to hundreds and thousands of people who spill over borders into geographically proximate countries. But the problem here is this: the reason why they are spilling over is because there's an important nexus that exists. And that nexus is this: is that there is a consideration of the United Nations that they fail in terms of mediating negotiations within instances of war, that they fail to exercise active duty as a global peacekeeping force of the world. In this particular scenario, because of the fact that the United Nations fail in terms of mediating wars within the Middle East or even in other nation states, we think that there's a responsibility for you to hold them legitimate to the kind of conventions that you have and the duties that you have. The global, the failure to mediate means that the consensus that you acted as an international multilateral body, is that under status quo, your enforcement or the United Nations as a body has no form of enforcement policy whatsoever. And we think that it's time that the United Nations take a hard stance in terms of when do we necessarily. You have nation states that don't even want to ratify the Roman Treaty and still be acting in a particular manner that's not the same. But before I move on, sure.
So what we learned from the UN Environmental Summit is that the moment you attempt to impose binding limits, the discussion becomes dominated by incessant squabbling instead of meaningful discussion of solutions through cooperation.
A, we don't think that's mutually exclusive. You can still have a constructive discussion. But B, and this is another contribution, in terms of why it's very important for you to push countries to clarify their stance. Because as of right now, in the international global power play, countries always operate on the veil of ambiguity to what they necessarily believe as a particular nation state. That yes, I necessarily support one thing, or because I don't rectify it, I don't necessarily believe it fully, right? And to this particular extent, at the very least, the discussion is open up to individuals who naturally and actually want to be part of the discussion, as opposed to individuals who are ambiguous in terms of the kind of participation that they want to have within this particular scenario, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that in every particular scenario you will always have destructive discussions. At the very least, under your side of the house, you're not doing anything to aid the ability for you to have actual constructive discussions. And we think that it's high time that the United Nations take an actual stance, as opposed to just hiding behind the veil of not being able to enforce particular clauses within their constitution. We are very proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Member Paul.
What's that? Oh. Yep.
Imagine a Syrian man who flees persecution in his own country to Turkey, the only country with the semblance of recognition to his country where he came from or where his family has gone, and then is traded off to a poor African country because Turkey has the money to do that. What happens to this individual and the conflict is something we cannot ever support on side closing opposition. This debate, Mr. Speaker, is not about countries like Australia who are overburdened and are likely to de-ratify without consequence, but countries who can but choose not to take refugees and prefer to trade them off to poorer countries, Mr. Speaker, the countries which remain within the convention and sell their refugees off to countries who need the money, and what happens to refugees after that. That's what this debate is and should be about, not about what just happened before me. I want to talk to you about a few things. Firstly, we change the incentives of countries to sell individuals, and then what happens when these individuals go to poorer countries. Secondly, for the first time, why trading refugees is a bad thing and why it's important for refugees to end up in certain countries. And lastly, why collectivization is an important strength and the only political strength that refugees ever have, not when you split the refugees across and trade them to countries where they have no semblance or connection to their home country. Firstly, what do you do to incentives of countries? And there's been extensive discussion inside opening opposition about whether countries are going to de-ratify or not. We think that probably it is that they are going to de-ratify. But what happens to countries who do not de-ratify, right? These often developed countries who can now shirk their responsibility by quoting a minimum which they themselves have a disproportionate amount of power to define in the first place. We think that's the first problem with this policy. But secondly, what's likely under Gulf model is refugees are going to be traded off to somewhere where they cannot even fit. Rich countries, for example, have an incentive to do this because they can pay a small one-time payment to poorer countries and then completely forget about refugees versus continuing to keep these individuals within their own country and be forced to give rights to these individuals in the same manner they do to citizens. There is a disproportionate incentive for them to sell these individuals off. You actually allow that to happen and also you also cast a veil of responsibility by saying that this is a legitimate thing to do. Under Gulf model, it's likely these individuals are shoved to poor countries who need these one-time payments and have likelihood of accepting these payments. What happens in the world where Gulf model passes? Poor countries already have a forced quota of refugees, which is forced onto them by developed countries in the first place, but now also have a large number of other refugees who they accept because they're getting paid. All refugees on the planet end up in random poor countries with no ability to affect either political discourse or ability to extend rights to individuals within these countries. Why is trading of individuals bad? Firstly, often refugees go to places where they're either best assimilated or best able to start lives all over again. We think refugees deserve this much after their lives have been torn apart by governments which have raped and killed their family members, they've lost their jobs and no ability to connect back to their home. They often choose countries based on things like language and culture, which is essential for these individuals to ever establish a livelihood in these new countries that they go to. You completely destroy the ability of these individuals to ever assimilate within societies when countries can just trade them off to a random country where there's no semblance to the place where they come from. But often things like religion and similarity are often to ensure these individuals don't get discriminated against. The fact that this is the only thing they find in common, for example, when Syrians flee over to Turkey as a starting point for them to gain assimilation into this society. Under your paradigm, you don't actually ask these refugees where they want to go, but split them up and put them wherever you feel is more convenient for you, or where the quota of a random country whose quota is unfilled or who's willing to trade with you. And these refugees' lives are completely destroyed when they're discriminated against, treated as second-class citizens, and can no longer establish their lives ever again. Sit down. But why is it important for refugees to end up in certain places, Mr. Speaker? Because we think, firstly, lives of refugees are much better when they're in certain developed nations versus when they end up in poorer nations, for example. Firstly, because even if you pay these poorer nations some amount of money, it's exceptionally hard for you to track whether this money ever goes to using for those refugees in the first place, because poorer nations almost always have terrible methods of accountability. But secondly, certain countries provide for far better ability of these refugees to gain rights and fight for the conflict that they came from. For example, media systems or political systems in developed countries are far easier to access as compared to poor countries who often don't have these systems or prevent access to individuals. Things like political clout, Mr. Speaker, is far greater on the hands of a country like Turkey or Australia, who either accept these refugees or consider them as a problem, as opening said, and have some ability to affect change in the political discourse in the nation. The reason, for example, Australia is pressuring Indonesia in the first place is because they don't want more refugees to come to their borders. Now that Australia can just pay some money and ship these individuals off to a country which doesn't have this political ability or clout in the international forum is extremely problematic. But some countries actually care about rights, right? When you ship these refugees off to countries which are poor, there's no ability for you to ever know what happened to these individuals, and they just get lost. And forgotten. Why is it important for refugees to be together? Before that, yes.
Somalia takes refugees and only give them $1 a day and use the money to other places, presumably the United Nations can sanction these countries. But under your side of the house, what is the exclusive proposal and benefit to protect these individuals?
All right. So what we're saying is actually worse off, because we don't think it's feasible for you to say that once these individuals get traded off, there's an increased ability for developed nations to care what happens to these people, because they've already done their bit by accepting these people and paying their taxpayers' money to ship them off to different countries. Sit down. Why refugees good when they're together? Because we think the ability to collectivize and pressure any sort of change is hinged on the ability of refugee communities not to be split up and shared across different communities. Often the only source of media attention or ability to affect political change is the numbers that these individuals have and the conflicts they represent. The incentives of nations and people to force changes in the national discourse, when you have a large collective of refugees who come to your country and represent one single voice, is far greater rather than when the refugees from a conflict are come to your country and then are split across different nations because you don't want to take them. We think it's important for these refugees to collectivize within countries and force any kind of political discourse, because it's the only way for these individuals to do so. But geographical location, Mr. Speaker, is also an important factor to consider when refugees go to certain countries. Like countries closer to the conflict often have a far better ability to affect change within the countries where the conflict is happening. Things like either by force or by assisting governments or by sending resources or by being part of the similar union like the African Union or being part of a similar trade group, which is more likely if you're closer to that nation, means that it's important for refugees to be in countries which are geographically close to the ones that they come from. Even the ability to return to their countries, for example, after the conflict is over, is far greater in instances where there are refugees going to nations where they already come from. But lastly, by splitting up and paying countries who have nothing to do with the conflict, you reduce any incentive or ability of these countries to ever affect any kind of change. Like what happens when hundreds and thousands of Syrian refugees are taken and split up into random African countries who have nothing to do with the conflict? Not only are the lives of these individuals destroyed, but they have no ability to affect any kind of political change because the countries they've sold to have no incentive. The countries who sold them, i.e. the developed countries, have already done their bit by accepting them and paying the money, and you ratify that under the UN by saying that this is your responsibility and this is what you ought to do. You already prescribed these minimums which these developed countries now look to defend their positions by, right? Countries like the US and UK just say, like, well, look, we've established a minimum. It was through discourse, which is probably likely not proportionally weighted in the first place, and say, we've done our bit and we ought not to do any more, Mr. Speaker. We think status quo is far better in that instance when refugees naturally flock to developed countries and naturally flock to countries with the ability to affect most amount of change. We think because we make the lives of refugees far better and we increase the ability of them to impact the conflicts they came from, we're very proud to win.
Thank you very much. Please invite the government.
Can anyone see me? Mr. Chair, the reason the Convention for Refugees was even established was because nations were worried about their borders. Nations were worried that refugees were running in and out of borders, and there was no one way of controlling or organizing these refugees towards direct borders, right? So the reason why this convention was established was to regulate that exactly. So we think that there will always be political will for people to sign the convention, as well for political will for people to care about the problem of refugees, because the problem of refugees is a global issue that will affect every nation at the end of the day, right? So, like for example, nations that sign a benefit of being a signatory. So if you are a signatory and in a moment where you cannot accommodate enough refugees, and because you're going through either civil crisis or an economic crisis, you can demand other signatories to help you and aid you. But if you're not a signatory and a lot of refugees enter your border illegally, you are not a priority towards the signatories. So therefore you are not consequential in the discussion as well as the discourse and accountability. So there will always be a reason for people to sign in and not leave. Secondly, on this idea of symbolic discourse, that's a running discussion from opening as well as closing. What they wanted was political will and discourse that are symbolic and don't go anywhere. Because we already told you that international pressure, as well as pressure from nations like Australia, don't hold much weight when they don't have enough, they don't require them to fulfill their minimum responsibility anyway. But secondly, how is discourse better under our paradigm when only genuine and sincere signatories are involved? That means signatory that actually contribute back to the refugee. That means that discourse will be more constructive and realistic as opposed to idealistic. Like for example, Australia constantly condemns the fact that certain nations aren't giving appropriate standard of living to refugees without considering whether or not the taking in that amount of refugees is even beneficial to that nation, or whether or not the cost benefit between taking refugees and standard of living is something realistic. So we think that the discourse will move on to something more grounded, like whether or not Thailand should take in that much refugees given their current situation and their current civil crisis, or whether or not certain nations should be allowed to give a lower standard of living as long as they take in a lot of refugees in the moment where we have an influx of refugees. So you see how the discussion become more realistic towards saving more refugees as opposed to meaningless, idealistic, and symbolic discussion that don't go anywhere and impose an idealistic restriction, right? No, thank you, sir. Their concern on side opposition was that nations can abuse their power of wealth. But we told you at the very least that if Australia sell their spot or their responsibility off to, let's say, Thailand, they can hold Thailand accountable so that Australia can demand Thailand to show what have they done with the money that we gave to you. So at least there's an increased political power and increased legitimacy in Australia demanding a higher, better standard of living for refugees in Thailand or refugees in Bangladesh. So we think that political pressure under our paradigm is much better. Second concern is that they will only fulfill their minimum standard. But if that is the attitude of the nation, for example, like Bangladesh and such nations, right? They will always fulfill their minimum standard anyways. They would have fulfilled below their minimum standard to begin with. So what we do is at least impose a threshold that they can accomplish based on how we assess their capability. So if they are capable of taking this much of refugees, we assess and we impose that amount on them. At least they don't have a legitimate reason to say no anymore. So we think it's better on the outside. Minimum standard is better than an arbitrary standard that only exists under their paradigm. Furthermore, it's this weird idea that refugees want to choose to go to certain places which they feel comfortable. Unfortunately, under status quo, not all refugees are so lucky, because the problem, they seem to live in an idealistic world where we don't have a problem of influx of refugees anyway. Because the problem with status quo is that if you have an influx of refugees, a lot of refugees are denied entrance at places where are their preferences anyway. Where they go to are places where they do not have consent to enter, where they are treated horribly. But it's the only place they can go to because they have no other choice to begin with. And they cannot go through your natural system, or they cannot go through United Nations because there's not enough place to accommodate all of them. So under their paradigm, there's no way those refugees will be able to be in places where they are comfortable to begin with, right? No, thank you, sir. So on our side, what we say is better is that at least we create an overall also a better sentiment on the refugees. Like for example, the running sentiment on refugees is that they are an imposition rather than a responsibility. What we are trying to change is the mindset that refugees are such an imposition and move toward refugees being a collective responsibility. Go, sir.
What happens to refugees when you split them up and create them to random countries with no semblance to either their own country or the country they came from?
We think that those things are easily tackled under status quo, like how you give political pressure to certain nations to look after your refugees and not expose them to xenophobia or not expose them to other places to begin with. And those mechanisms exist better under our paradigm anyway, right? Furthermore, this was two things that weren't responded to by side closing opposition, right? We told you that United Nations finally need to take a stand on their refugee ideals, because it seems that United Nations are as well as the Convention of Refugees, are losing their significance year by year. And Jay already told you that this discussion is very important to show that United Nations is able to uphold whatever they have promised under status quo. Furthermore, we also tell you that it's important, no thank you, sir, to clarify the stance of each country on their position on refugees, as well as their position on global issues and things like that. This is important because now nations cannot just ideally say that we have a need to send a message or some opinions on a matter that we don't have an interest on or we are not contributing to. So as long as you're contributing, then you can have a meaningful input on the discussion that's extremely realistic to begin with. So we think that at the very least, under side government, we're able to create a better form of accountability and a better form of minimum standard onto various different nations. And the idea that you can trade these spots, allow nations that sell their spots off to hold those nations accountable towards their responsibility, and political pressure happen better under our paradigm. We really don't think nations will leave this signatory because it's a global interest when it comes to refugees, and every nation want to protect their own border to begin with. So we think that every nation will not opt out of this issue. At the end of the day, refugees are people who aren't able to move between borders freely because there's no existence of a safe place for them. There's very little place for them to go. So any exclusive benefit under their paradigm doesn't exist, we propose.
To conclude the debate, we invite the opposition.
Whose phone is this?
Side closing government's extension is at best value neutral, because we also agree on side opposition that there is a need to uphold the legitimacy of the convention. What we never heard was why that legitimacy is dependent on the quantity of refugees countries take in rather than any other standard for that convention. We don't think that a country signing into that convention has any reason to depend its legitimacy or its stance or its clarity of stance based on the number of refugees they take in. We're going to do three things in this speech. One, we're going to look at the incentives to sign into the convention and why we think it is absolutely random for them to say, well, it's a global interest and every country in the world will want to be a part of this. Two, we're going to look at why we think that there is the issues of quality standards are actually not mutually exclusive and something that both sides can take care of. And three, we're going to look at the extension from closing opposition on trading off refugees and the concept of trading in and of itself, and why we think poorer countries and refugees are the two people or the two actors that are worse off from their policy. Let's start with the issues of incentives of signing in. Let's make one thing clear. Signing into a convention is not mandatory. If it was such a global interest, then every country would be signed to it. Clearly, it's not. Not all countries care about refugee statuses or care about what's happening. It's done by choice. You need to give countries a reason to want to sign into that convention. It's also extremely tedious for these countries to want to do this because there's a lot of work that goes into it, whether or not it's just purely ratification by your parliament. If a country chooses to be a signatory, you can be fairly certain of a domestic interest to take in refugees on their own accord, regardless of whether you place a standard or not. Government policy today tells these countries that their current efforts are just not enough until they take up a quantity of people rather than a quality of people. That is principally the wrong message to send when your end goal is to have as many possible actors involved in helping refugees. The argument from them is they won't leave us because it'll look bad. That's just not true, because government policy gives them the reason to leave. It gives them the reason to say, well, let's de-ratify this now because you now force them to take a capacity of people that they just don't want to take. Because yes, they economically may be able to take these people in, but maybe they have other economic priorities. Maybe they want to spend this money on their own citizens for a change. We think that that's a good thing if countries want to do that, and they don't have to take in that number of people. You give them a reason to now say, it's either spend, say, 10% of my GDP on refugees or de-ratify the entire thing. I will choose to de-ratify it. So we don't think that that actually means an incentive to stay in. But two, we told you that most of these countries or the poorer countries in this often don't get a say in the minimum that's set, right? Because some countries will have a disproportionate say in what this minimum is. That puts a larger burden on some countries other than others, which again makes the incentive to de-ratify this convention a lot greater on some countries other than others. It was even stranger for government whip to come up here and say, well, more countries will now sign because we're telling them if you are over it away to others. That's the exact opposite, right? Because if you're struggling and overburdened, that's exactly when you don't have the money to pay to give your quota to someone else and let another country take your burden for you. That's exactly when you'll be forced to be overrun by refugees because you have no opportunity to give your refugees to anyone else. But lastly, we tell you the countries that are the most prone to refugees coming to their own land will be the countries who choose to not sign the convention because now they have to take accountability for each of the people that come through their land and pay for them to go to somewhere else, which makes it so much more difficult for a poorer country that is more prone to refugees coming to them, which means the number of countries that actually sign to this is going to be extremely limited. Before we go into quality opening.
Why is it better to leave them rot in processing with nowhere else to go than to send them to at least some small number of countries with a minimum standard?
That's assuming that all of these countries actually are signatories first. You don't meet the first standard. But two, we think that the option is that most of the time these people are going to be in the processing line anyway, because these are countries that are not going to be able to meet those standards to begin with. Let's go into quality standards. We think on the first level that quality standards are a rather strange metric for this debate, because quality standards are not mutually exclusive, right? On opposition, we can set quality standards too without putting a quantity or minimum cap on this side. But we think that it's far better if you want to make quality standards to have more refugees in more developed countries or have more refugees in, say, Australia rather than Thailand, because obviously as a UN, we have the ability to guarantee the quality standards better in countries like Australia than in Thailand. But two, we think that there's ability to have better quality standards when you have the ability as a UN to ensure one criteria rather than the other. You cannot tell a country you both need to meet large high quality standards and you need to take in large numbers simultaneously. You choose one burden at a time when you try and convince individuals of something, right? Either quality or quantity, and we think most countries cannot do both simultaneously. And on this side, we are much happier to say we choose quality over quantity for basically all the reasons side government wanted to tell you about quality. Let's look at refugees and trading, because that's what they didn't want to deal with. At the end of the day, their policy does mean that individuals are not going to end up together even when they should. For people, for example, say from Syria, who should end up collectively in one area, what happens on their side is that Turkey can now say, no, I've met my minimum quota, I don't care what you say, just go somewhere else. We've paid, say, for example, Bangladesh to take you in. Then they have to go to Bangladesh in order for this to happen, in order for this entire model to work. The problem is this: they don't end up being in a country that's geographically or proximity-wise good for them, because they don't get the ability to collectivize, they don't get the ability to get any benefits for themselves as refugees, any semblance of connection to their families, any semblance of connection to people of their own. We think that simply saying we can ensure there's no xenophobia is not enough, because it's not just about how that one individual is treated, but how he is put into a place where there's no one else like him, or where everyone else of his own type, of his own nationality are not there. But we think that influx in refugees in poor countries is going to be rather obvious, right? Because there's a disproportionate incentive to pay off poor countries to take their quota and feel like they've made their moral obligation because they've paid some money to meet that moral obligation anyway. There's no impact on these big developed countries from a reputation hurt, because obviously they still trade with all of these countries anyway. But lastly, we think the counterfactual on our side is at least they flock to developed countries where better and more processes together can happen. In conclusion, in the war on side opposition, each country may take less refugees, but A, more countries will be interested in taking up the burden, but B, the quality of life of the refugees is a lot higher. Go with closing opposition.
Please,